Well, good morning and welcome to the January installment of the WVCTSI Research Boot Camp. Our presenters for today's program are Dr. Remick and Dr. Naim. Dr. Remick is the director of the Mary Babb Randolph Cancer Center and the Lawrence and Jean DeLynn Chair of Oncology Research and Professor of Medicine. He has designed and implemented and performed numerous clinical research studies and has had a major impact in this field. Dr. Remick has a rich history of bringing extramural funding to the university and has been an excellent mentor to many young, aspiring researchers. Dr. Naim is the director of the WVCTSI Research Trials Research Unit, as well as the director of the Mary Babb Randolph Cancer Center's CTRU. Dr. Naim and his excellent staff has assisted numerous clinical investigators to develop quality and impactful research projects. The CTRU is a critical component of the WVCTSI and has taken clinical trial development and implementation to a very nice new level at the university. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Good. That's the button. So I didn't know who all would be here, so I want to thank you, and I want to thank Fred Manier for inviting me to give this talk. I'm sure there are all sorts of different types of folks here. And I also want to thank my colleagues, because what we're replicating was what was the first, a good portion of this was one of the first joint Cancer Center CTSI efforts. Oh, I'm sorry, we have distance sites, I'm sorry. Where we presented some background information on investigator-initiated studies. So I want to take this opportunity really to thank Alex Chi, who's in the Department of Radiation Oncology, a new assistant professor, Manga, who's our medical director of the Clinical Trials Unit, and Dr. Shomit Basu and Farhad Kimani. Shomit is in the section of Hematology Oncology, and Farhad is a fellow. And they each have developed, which I'm going to talk about very briefly, but lay the groundwork for you to think about how you can get clinical trials or clinical studies funded. And each one of these investigators has come about it a different way, and it gives you a nice template or roadmap to think of the variety of ways that you can get funding for a research project. The other thing we hope to achieve, we're going to kind of tag team it. I'll give the bulk of the talk, but I want to turn to John, who's going to help us with some of the elements in terms of developing a budget for a research project. But what the Cancer Center Trials Unit is doing, and John and the rest of the group, is supporting the CTSI in terms of building their clinical trials infrastructure. And our Bible in the Cancer Center we call the Blue Book. It's our operations and procedures manuals for clinical studies in the Cancer Center. It is inviolate, and it is a roadmap, and it is a very dynamic document because as we proceed and as our operations mature, we are constantly editing it and updating it to facilitate and monitor our trials operations. Similarly, there is progress being made on a gold book, which is for non-cancer clinical trials. And many of these things will become operational or are already operational. Maybe at the end with questions, John can update us about it. But the point is for this audience, despite what we do in the Cancer Center, all CTSAs across the country model and replicate CCSG, clinical trials management, and non-cancer NIH, other clinical trials management. So these policies and procedures help the investigator, help the research team, protect patients, ensure safety. And there are so many resources in our Blue Book for investigators as you try to conceive protocols, draft letters of intent for a concept, translate that into a protocol, work with our biostatisticians, work with the different core facilities that we have in the Cancer Center and that we also have access to in the WVCTSI. So that's the background. I think another thing that's underappreciated is really the volume of our trials activity for a cancer center our size is just growing exponentially. We're now approaching about 200 patients per year on therapeutic trials. And when I first got here back in 2007, I thought a target would be about 300. The Cancer Center is on the verge of developing a statewide clinical trials network that hopefully, if that gets up to speed, we'd nearly double our trials accrual. And that's not necessarily immediate for discussion here. But more importantly, we have our operations in place to monitor and identify all sorts of study subjects to clinical trials. And that's what's reflected in this slide. We have a host of non-therapeutic studies. They might be laboratory correlative studies. It could be companion studies to a clinical trial. It could be prevention studies. It could be epidemiological studies. And then we also track all our retrospective studies, population studies, where we're identifying subjects to participate in surveys. A lot of this volume of activity, we have used Bonnie's Bus as a platform for patient outcomes-oriented research, breast cancer and healthcare utilization research. So we have, by any stretch of the imagination, for a cancer center our size, a very robust clinical trials unit. And I've been at many institutions, and I've been at many prominent institutions, and WVU is a prominent institution. Our trials unit here is as good as any trials unit I've ever been affiliated with. And you folks need to know that, because sometimes you don't take advantage of the resources that you have in your trials unit. And I know we're growing, but the hope will be you're going to have the same resources in the clinical trials unit as part of the CTSI. Now this next slide, a few years ago we couldn't have shown this slide. And this is just a quick menu of the investigator-initiated studies in our cancer center. And this is the lifeblood of any vibrant academic health sciences center, whether it's a cancer center or non-cancer related activities. The real fun, the real inquiry, the real moving some concepts forward is how robust is your investigator-initiated research portfolio. That is, how are your investigators, your young faculty, and your senior faculty generating ideas to support studies that lay the groundwork for new funding opportunities. And you'll see here we have now a menu of studies that we never had before. And the complexity of managing investigator-initiated studies raises the bar on what the clinical trials unit has to do and what we have to do to monitor these trials, because these trials, for the most part, do not have a sponsor. The sponsor is the Cancer Center. And we have obligations to the IRB, and in some instances we may have obligations to FDA. So we have to be accountable for patients that we're putting on our own investigator-initiated studies. And we'll draw your attention to the very bottom study that's bracketed as an outstanding example of a quality, very high quality investigator-initiated study that was led by Dr. Mehdi Hamadani, who unfortunately is no longer with us, left for personal reasons. He thrived here. And his study was the basis of a Career Development Award, American Society of Clinical Oncology Career Development Award. This study was published in the Journal of Clinical Oncology, which is among the preeminent and one of the highest impact factors clinical journals in cancer medicine today. And this could lay the foundation for a large national trial looking at the role of atorvastatin in immune modulatory effects in controlling graft versus host disease. And this was a single institution study. He recruited 30 transplant patients here at WVU and 30 siblings. And that's going to be a strategy that you're going to hear from us today, is how to be successful in terms of developing your own study. You have to know your patient population, the people you're serving. Here's another slide illustrative of other types of investigator-initiated studies. These are supportive care trials. These are interventional trials, not immediately therapeutic, but trying to manage complications of chemotherapy. And then here are a range of investigator-initiated correlative studies as well. Some are involving PK, some very nice concepts, looking at the distribution of drugs in patients that are obese. This is a problem we see in our patient population here. So we want to understand how the body handles the drug in patients that might be overweight. And you see the different menus of studies here. So the take-home point is, in a relatively short period of time, the Cancer Center is beginning to really build a portfolio of investigator-initiated studies. And that's what we hope to provide for the non-cancer side of the operation. Or not so much provide, but provide the expertise to support the clinical research infrastructure so investigators in the CTSI can lead their own studies. So that's the backdrop. This is a quick list, and everybody needs to be familiar about it. There are many ways to get funding for your study, and many of our pilot studies actually many of our investigator-initiated studies, started with pilot funding in the Cancer Center. And there are pilot funding opportunities in the CTSI afforded through the CTR grant. So in the Cancer Center, we have an institutional grant that we hope we will be recompeting this spring. I hope we will be competitive. It has been an extraordinarily successful and vital resource. It was a $180,000 grant over 3 years, and basically it supported 5 or 6 investigator-initiated trials on pilot studies on the order of $30,000 per protocol or study, and that these funds then are to support early investigators early in their career, the first 7 years of a faculty appointment, and these are peer-reviewed, and these pilot grants hopefully lead to other successor studies. And in fact, I highlighted Dr. Hamadani's study. His initial study was launched with an ACS pilot grant, led to a career development award, led to the success of his clinical trial, and a platform of studies that he led here and is continuing to lead. There's a mechanism for the CTSI as well that supports pilot studies. There's the Peace Corps Research Corporation has a funding mechanism. It's actually a bridge mechanism, and this mechanism, more than any other, is to take an investigator that has submitted an NIH grant application, and has a meritorious review and the summary statement, and you're applying, this is I think solicited about once a year. You're applying for some bridge support to get that grant over the top to get an award. And the Chancellor's Office also supports bridge and research funding development grants, and in most of these instances, some of the parameters on these awards change in terms of the need for the investigators, but it's an investigator who, again, may have received a meritorious review that was just not quite enough sufficient to get funded, and you're asking for some funds to carry that project forward to see if you can get it over the top. And in some cases, there may be opportunities for investigators that have lost funding or are in transition. The point is, there is a robust portfolio for an institution our size of different types of mechanisms to support your research. In addition, there are a whole host of peer-reviewed opportunities. NIH, NCI, other non-cancer related areas. Professional societies. All of your professional societies have different types of funding. And also foundation may be peer-reviewed or may not be peer-reviewed. Similarly, there are a whole host of career development awards. And if you're smart, you develop a series of 1 or 2 pilot studies that lay the foundation for a career development award if you have the appropriate mentors. And when I say mentors, you can have a mentor. It's best to have a mentor here, but it doesn't mean you cannot have a mentor elsewhere. And you can partner with a mentor here and a mentor elsewhere. And as long as you're credible with how you're framing that relationship, that should not diminish your application. And that's another thing we were able to achieve with Dr. Hamadani, because he came from Ohio State and we continued to work with his mentor. And many of our scientists in the Cancer Center, we encourage them to maintain the relationships with their former labs. You have to achieve independence, so they have to also keep it at arm's length. But until you get your first award, those are strategies you need to take advantage of. And you need to pay attention to funding announcements that specifically provide opportunities for new investigators or investigators getting their first time independent award, and then sometimes investigators that might be from an underserved population or minority applicant. Now and then finally, pharmaceutical sponsorship. You can capitalize on pharma. The market has just turned around, and there's a whole host of money that now is in the pockets of pharmaceutical industries that are looking to fund investigator-initiated projects that might align with their interests. And I think the perspective, I'm going to just digress just a minute here, that we take in the Cancer Center, is that for any research portfolio, it needs to be balanced. It's like your retirement portfolio, right? Any kind of investment portfolio any one of us has, no matter how young or old or how rich or poor or wherever it is, you want balance. So we have to have efforts that are aligned with NCI. We have to have efforts that are aligned with our own institutional opportunities or foundations, and you have to have efforts that link to industry. And make no mistake, at least in cancer medicine, industry is the genesis of a whole host of new drugs. That's where we're seeing more and more investment, R&D, that are providing new drugs in the clinic. So the approach we take in the Cancer Center is that we really want to try to balance our research portfolio, and wherever we can, we're going to have an illustration of that, we want to secure pharmaceutical support. And there are guidelines to protect us, to protect conflicts of interest and conflicts of time. Now, I should have had one slide here in the Cancer Center. I'm going to give you 3 rules of grant writing. I've had 3 rules in my entire career for grant writing. The first is, and it might sound silly, but you cannot get funded if you don't write a grant. I cannot tell you how many colleagues don't understand that concept. You cannot get funded if you don't write a concept or a protocol or a grant. Can't get it. So you have to spend the elbow grease and have an idea. Okay? The second thing is, if you're going to write 1 grant, then you might as well write 2 or 3 grants. You take that one concept and you repackage it to a different funding agency, and that's fine. And in this day and age, no funder or no agency is going to be critical of that. And goodness gracious, if you're the good fortune of having the same grant funded 2 or 3 times, well, guess what? You're going to have the opportunity to figure out which grant you're going to select to do the work. There may not be as much overlap on some of the projects. That's happened to a scientist in the Cancer Center, got an NIH grant and had a grant with the Suman Komen Foundation. And one of the aims in the Komen grant overlapped with the NIH grant, so that wasn't awarded. The third rule is whenever you can cut the denominator of a grant, you write that grant. And by that I mean, if there's something about the RFA or the request for the proposal or the FOA or whatever it is that slices the number of competitors for that grant, and you're in that denominator, that's the grant you write. And that's very important. When we had our COBRA grant, when we had pilot money for that, because the COBRA grant linked to NIH funding where they had these big supplemental awards in the Cancer Center when we were in phase 2. And there was an investigator in the Cancer Center that didn't want to apply to the grant. And I said, you're crazy, because already 80% of the country is knocked out of the pool for that grant. If you're a new investigator, guess what? That gives you some opportunity. So that's what I mean by cutting the denominator of a grant. If you have an opportunity that you qualify for where others can't compete and it's in your area of expertise, you write that grant. And now a fourth rule, which is not one of my big 3, when you write grants, you have to publish. And it's very important to publish on the projects that you are funded for. And cite the grant in your publication. Cite the Cancer Center. Cite the CTR grant. Cite whatever. Right? And you have to have a balance because you're going to be writing papers and you're going to be writing grants. It's very difficult to write papers and grants at the same time. So you have to have that spirit about putting pen to paper. And none of this is a 9-to-5 job. All right, so there's the list of all the different funding opportunities. I threw in some extraneous comments about strategies or my rules of grant writing and balance. And dollars are green no matter where they come from, and as long as you have an idea, that's the beauty of being on an academic faculty and pursuing these opportunities. This just shows you, this is in our blue book. I'm not going to belabor this. It probably doesn't transmit well on the slide, but in the Cancer Center, we have a pathway, like a signaling cascade, how you manage a research proposal. And I would encourage you, If it's not in the Gold Book yet, is the Gold Book online? I don't even know if it's, so we have the Blue Book online. Maybe John can give you, I have a list of resources. There are so many pieces of information in our Blue Book that help investigators. And this shows you the flow of how you develop a concept. Now, as I said at the outset, I'm going to walk you through 3 examples of investigator-initiated projects that the Cancer Center enabled. Alex Chi, as I said at the outset, radiation oncologist. We are supporting 2 of his pilot studies that ultimately we hope will serve as the basis for a career development award. We supported his candidacy. We nominated him to go to the Vail Conference last summer to learn about clinical trials methodologies. He has competed for an ACS IRG pilot grant, so he has funding that underpins one of his concepts, and that will translate well for a career development award. So now you begin to see how you connect the dots. The second example is Dr. Manga, who has worked to develop a concept on his own that he has sought pharmaceutical sponsorship, and he has just learned this week, it was a national peer review undertaken by Celgene, and he has just received a $500,000 grant for a clinical study in non-small cell lung cancer. And then the third example is Shomit Basu and a fellow, Farhad, got together on a very novel concept, taking an ancient drug, mitomycin, adding it to decitabine for elderly patients with leukemia. And this application is now being reviewed at the CTSI pilot grant program. Investigator-initiated study. Very neat. Now, what I'm not doing in each one of these studies, these were not just clinical trials, each one of these studies engages laboratory scientists looking at biological correlates of drug effect or resistance or some mechanism that is important that isolates the drug or the question they're looking at. Very important. Some journals now do not publish studies, at least in my area of expertise, without some sort of laboratory correlative endeavor. And it's very important to begin to understand dose-response relationships, less important prognostic relationships, more important predictive relationships. By that I mean you want to know if your patient has this characteristic or this protein or this gene expression or this mutation, or I'll give you the time-honored approach. Everybody in this room has heard of the estrogen receptor. So women with breast cancer that have a positive estrogen receptor, guess what? Biologically, that correlates with prognosis. Women tend to do better. But what's more important? What's more important with a woman who has estrogen receptor positive breast cancer is the doctor knows I can take tamoxifen off the shelf, give it to the woman, and have a 70 to 80% chance that they're going to respond. That's where contemporary medicine is right now. Many of your colleagues do not understand that basic concept. We're all hung up on how long does a patient live. When you look at the cost of health care, drug prescription, how can we identify a patient who's going to respond to a drug, whether they're diabetic, they have hypertension, arthritis, renal insufficiency, whatever, you name it. That's where we're going in the clinic, in any area of medicine. Cancer's probably a little bit further along. HIV medicine. What is it that is going to guide the clinician, the investigator, to take that drug off the shelf and give it to them? Or what is it in their genetic makeup, their protein, the different genes that are being expressed that guide an outcome? So more often than not, in any kind of clinical trial, more so in cancer, you have to drill down into some biological pharmacodynamic effect. What does the drug do to the body? And that's the same for any area of medicine. So keep that in the back of your mind when you look at your different studies. Now I'm talking more, I should be careful, because we're talking more about clinical therapeutics research. There's a whole realm of population research, community-based research, and many of these principles are all the same, don't get me wrong, but obviously you may not be looking at a drug effect or a clinical intervention. You're looking at trends in populations or why people make decisions for doing different things, modifications in behavior. I mean, so I want to be clear on that. I'm not saying this is be-all, end-all, but just using this as a platform to get folks thinking about things. This is probably, of all the things to have a successful investigator-initiated study, this one slide summarizes it. And I don't care what kind of area of inquiry you are in, whether it's basic, clinical, translational, population, outcome. You must have a hypothesis. And I'll give you a very nice example of a hypothesis we had in the trials unit that we wrote a grant for to the Benedum Foundation that has nothing to do with clinical trials, or it has nothing to do with the drug effect. And we had a hypothesis that there's the outmigration of cancer care in this state. The center of the state, the population center, is Charleston. Guess where the second most dense population area is in our state? It's the periphery. You look at West Virginia. The periphery of this state is the second largest population center. Very rural state. You got Morgantown, you got Wheeling, you got Parkersburg, you got Beckley, you got Martinsburg. Guess what? They're all in the periphery of the state. And guess we're what? We're bordered by 5 states. So if you live in Wheeling, you might go to Pittsburgh, might go to Cleveland. You live in Martinsburg, you might go to Baltimore, go to Hopkins, go to D.C. Don't ask me why, but if you live in Parkersburg or Huntington, I should say Huntington, they end up in the Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida. They have a relationship there. You're in Charleston, you end up in the Cleveland Clinic sometimes. Ohio State and Parkersburg, you get the picture, right? So we had a hypothesis on a cancer prevention, cancer control project. We said we are losing patients out of state to cancer care. And the patients we are losing out of state to cancer care are, guess what, the least patients we would want to lose, because if they can leave the state, they can afford to leave the state. We wrote a grant. Benedum Foundation got $25,000 to do it. I didn't even have the slide up here, but this shows you how you think about a hypothesis. And we discovered through publicly identifiable databases, working with West Virginia Oncology Society, on and on and on, 20% of cancer care in this state is out of state. And what was more important, the economic impact of that outmigration of cancer care translated into $350 million of business. Patients have to drive, they have to get gas, have to stay at a hotel. But the thing that we really miss more than anything else, our patients have diabetes and cancer, they have heart disease and cancer, they have kidney problems, they have arthritis, they have all the problems you're trying to deal with, and cancer, right? They're doctoring for those problems out of state in addition to their cancer. So I'm using that as a very crisp example. You must have a hypothesis. If you don't have a hypothesis, you can't write your project. And everything flows from that hypothesis. And I'm going to tell you another thing. You can prove a hypothesis wrong. There's nothing wrong with that. It's great if it's right, but there might be some signal even if the hypothesis didn't come to fruition. Okay? So these are all the pieces following your hypothesis. Is it evidence-based? Thorough review of the literature. You should make a contribution to that literature. If it's a disease you're interested, write a review article. If it's a drug you're interested, write a review article. You should have the scholarship to back up the piece of investigation you're trying to pursue or you're proposing. Now, the next piece is very, very critical. And we have some advantages here. But you must, more so than any other place, know your patient population here to frame your study. So, for instance, we're not going to be doing studies of malaria in Morgantown, right? I mean, being facetious, but that's the point. Know your patient population. Know what we see here. Now you can interrogate Merlin. You can interrogate Epic to see what we have or what we don't have. And that's probably of all the things in Merlin that the CTR is going to be most helpful with. You have to be careful of the data that might be in Merlin, because we all enter the data and we all see our patient charts and we all see the errors that are in there. But more importantly, It can give you a denominator of what you have that may launch a project for you or a concept. So that's very, very important. And again, hark back to what Dr. Hamadadi's study was. For whatever reason, in our cancer center, this is one of the oldest, this is the median age in the state of West Virginia. It's the oldest state in the country. We see a lot of elderly patients with leukemia and myelodysplastic syndrome. And that's the basis for the study for Farhad and Shomit. And we have an active transplant program. So make sure whatever line of inquiry that you have the patient population here at your disposal to launch your pilot study, to get you the funding, to get you over the hump. We talked about the correlative science adds value, and we'll have a dedicated slide. It's nice to see Sinjin win. We have a very robust, we didn't have that when I first got here, but there is a very robust biostatistical group led by Matt Gurka in the CTSI. The Cancer Center has the good fortune of working with Sinjin Wen, who's a cancer biostatistician par excellence, who has a lot of expertise across a range of capabilities. You have your what does Matt call them? The little sit down, the stats, what is it? Walk-in clinics, right. Thank you for helping me. You know, he has it all online in the CTSI, the walk-in clinics. Your study has to be grounded in statistical concept, power analysis, outcome analysis, and things you're going to propose to analyze. And you engage the statistician at the very, very beginning. It's in that flow sheet. And the way it's configured in the Cancer Center and the CTR, that initial statistical support, the Cancer Center underwrites and the CTSI underwrites. But if you write a grant, the expectation is you have your statistician on your proposal. And you cannot get a study funded without robust statistics. And most clinical folks, I'll count myself, other population scientists, basic scientists, it's a death knell if you do not have a sound statistical approach in your concept and how you're going to analyze your data. And obviously it must be well written. In the Cancer Center, we have the value of developing a study in the context of our multidisciplinary teams. So we have a lung cancer team, we have a breast cancer team, we have a GI malignancy team. So anything that interfaces with a breast cancer project or a heme project, so forth, has to be vetted in that group to assure priority of the study, that team of investigators who sees those patients is going to be receptive to putting patients on the study, either directly themselves or referring patients to you. And I realize this may not be as robust in the CTSI, but there are areas, you know, the stroke team is pretty robust. There are some things that are a little bit more robust than others, but align your concept, if it's appropriate, to the clinical enterprise that is interfacing with the patients. And as I said, we have a variety of decision points where we say in the Cancer Center, now this is a study that we're going to support, or this is a study we're not going to support. And these are the reviews that the CTR does with any clinical trial. And the CTR, or the non-cancer clinical trials, will support this as well. Okay, I'm going to turn our attention now to the three projects, not going into a lot of details, but showing the building blocks. Alex came to the Cancer Center with a concept. He's actually published a lot about stereotactic ablative radiation therapy, which is a new concept in delivering intense dosages over very short periods of time in a very confined, three-dimensional way. And he's worked with some of our scientists. He's worked with some colleagues outside the institution. He's partnered with a mentor who's now in Chicago. He was a former colleague of his when he trained in Wisconsin. And he's proposing a dose escalation above what has been done for a very select group of lung cancer patients. Won't go into all the gory details. And you can see the laboratory components here outlined. And another thing is of interest is to look at the potential radiation sensitizing effects or toxicity of the pulmonary parenchyma. And there's some markers that he's proposing to analyze, which is perhaps very important given the more the not immediately conventional approach in terms of how he's designing his ports and administering radiation in his study. He has a hypothesis, he has laboratory correlative studies, he has a mentor who's aligned with this study. This was a study that was also discussed at his Vail conference last year. And he's worked with the biostatisticians, as we're going to constantly come back to help frame his study. He's had IRB approval in August. 2 patients, he screened 2 patients. He's still looking for a patient to start. And because we're trying to build our thoracic oncology program, we don't have as many patients as he would like at the outset. He's going to be giving presentations. Hopefully patients can be referred in who might otherwise not be candidates for surgery. And the important thing, he has a colleague and a partner that he's working in Chicago. Here's Dr. Manga's protocol. So I should go back. Alex's protocol was the subject of an ACS IRG pilot grant. So he has pilot funding to launch this study. And at the same time, he's written another study that's gone through our PRMC. And those 2 studies, we hope, once he gets a little bit of accrual under his belt on this study, and on this second study, he has another mentor at Northwestern University, phase 1 escalation study of radiation dose, of stereotactic radiation for lung cancer, that these 2 protocols then can become the platform for a career development award. Okay? And he has to get some patients on this study, has to get them both up, show feasibility, show capability, recruit the patients, do the correlative studies. Now we're turning our attention to Dr. Manga, who's in our trials unit. He was in clinical practice, and he's just a breath of fresh air. He's a very active oncologist. He has clinical interests in head and neck cancer, lung cancer, and melanoma. And he was intrigued with the observation of nab-paclitaxel, which is a different formulation of paclitaxel, in combination with gemcitabine for lung cancer. And he has worked with our scientists in the Cancer Center to look at some laboratory correlatives that might predict resistance to this drug. So these are his slides now. These slides I'm giving you are the slides of these investigators, just to help you see how they approach these different things. He has an interest in lung cancer. Frame a research question. Do not afraid to question the dogma. And in this case, platinum-based therapy has been the dogma for non-small cell lung cancer for 3 decades. And we're now beginning to look at some new doublets, combinations of drugs that do not include a carboplatin or a cisplatin. And he's looking at gemcitabine and paclitaxel. Again, coming back to this point, know your patient population. He's looking at our older population of patients that might be less toxic. So this is a slide I have to inject here. When he gave his talk, he said, Willie Sutton, everybody knows who Willie Sutton is. Maybe you don't, or you've heard of him. He was a famous bank robber. And he said, they asked him, well, why do you rob banks? He says, that's where the money is, right? So pharmaceutical industry right now, that's where the money is. Do not be afraid to develop a meritorious project. And the project he got was competed nationally, wrote a letter of intent, worked with our scientists, worked with Syngin, went to the sponsor liked it. Celgene is pretty robust. It went through many, many layers of review. And he's just gotten the letter. He had a little tease about 2-3 weeks ago. He's just gotten the letter. And this grant is funded, his project is funded $500,000 to recruit 25, 30 patients, I believe. Randomized, 40 patients, randomized study. I don't know the precise number. Now, that's another thing. He has a randomized phase 2 study. One of the things when you do an investigator-initiated study, if you can avoid randomization, you would do well to avoid randomization because there are many more complexities with a randomized study that I know Syngin could talk eloquently about because it's more complex, how you manage it, how do you assure equal randomization, and then the numbers of patients you need to do to really get meaningful data, you need many more patients. So this is not necessarily the best thing out of the box, but we have the patients, and Manesh proposed a very nice study. But if you can, to generate pilot data, you may want to stay away from a randomized study design. Not necessary. Greatly increases the complexity of the study and what you have to do. And these are the 2 arms. This is not so important for you. This was discussed in the our Cancer Trials 101. And here's turning our attention to our biostatistician. Manesh worked very closely with him, all of these investigators, not only on the clinical aspects of the study, but to help frame some of the parameters around the biological correlates. What can we generate with that data in tissue samples or blood samples? And what's very important here is that he's also highlighting, and sometimes the biostatistician can help you with this, you need to be very prescriptive in your inclusion and your exclusion criteria when you write a study. And you may have to modify it once you're up and running, but you really want to avoid that. So make sure the disease you're studying, you understand what it is you're trying to do, who you want to recruit, and be very prescriptive in who you're allowing to participate and who you're not allowing to participate. And the last thing you want to do is be writing all these exceptions, and we have rules in the Cancer Center that you can't do that, because that's a safety issue and that sends up a red flag to the IRB. So do not underestimate how you frame your study in terms of who you want on it. And then this last example is with Shomit and the fellow getting a concept together of an old drug, and in our line of work, NCI is actually, National Cancer Institute, is actually pushing the envelope and asking the cancer community, we should be looking at a lot of our older drugs to see if we can teach old drugs new tricks because of the expense. I mean, we have drug therapies now that are costing hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars for a course of therapy to get a patient through. It's no longer sustainable. So we are trying to look at different opportunities with old drugs to see if there's a mechanism that can be exploited, and that's what is in this case with adding decitabine for patients with elderly patients with leukemia and MDS. So he's walking us through, you know, his concept was in September 2012. This is part of the rationale, taking an old drug. Yeah, and the reason we can do this study, and this is, we had this discussion yesterday at Clinical Trials Working Group, decitabine is a new drug. That's expensive. It is approved for leukemia and MDS. Mitomycin C is a dinosaur. I mean, that's a drug that's been around since, just shortly after World War II. But it's not indicated for leukemia, right? Now, we could probably write the protocol and ask for third-party reimbursement. We don't want to challenge it. This drug to treat 20, 25 patients is like $5,000. It's like $50 a vial. I mean, it's very inexpensive. So that's another thing when you're designing concepts and you're looking at a therapeutic or interventional trial, look at the cost of drugs. Either get your sponsor to provide the drug, have to accommodate the drug in the budget if it's not for an indication you're using for. And that's the take-home. If it's an investigator-initiated study and it's a drug that's approved for what you're studying and you're using that drug, then that's a little different story. But in our line of work, this happens all the time where you just can't bill for an investigational drug, and you will cause more challenges if you're using a drug that is approved, particularly in this regulatory environment and economic environment. Even though it's approved, you're using it for a different disease. So be mindful of that. Then he polished the idea. I won't go through all this, but this was a time-consuming process. And then he said, put it on paper. He wrote an LOI. Think about the funding, writing the protocol. These are all the steps on that big flow sheet we gave you. Or it was in the beginning here. And as we said, his protocol now, this concept has been changed, has been translated into a protocol, and this is now the subject. This is going to be reviewed at the CTSI pilot grant. And I won't go through all the detail, but here's his study schema for his study. And he has laboratory correlates working with scientists looking at DNA repair mechanisms. So I'm going to turn our attention to John. We have about 4 or 5 more slides to help you look at what are the elements of a budget for a clinical trial.
So I get to give you the dry presentation because that was an excellent overview, and I can't stress enough that the first thing that we start with is a well-crafted protocol before we even talk about budgets. So put your effort there. Am I going backward?
No, you're right.
Okay. So here is an outline of where you start. So you have to start with your protocol, and then from your protocol you're going to develop basically a calendar for how your subjects are going to be moving through the spectrum of treatment or study. And from that, you can create a spreadsheet and determine costs at each element of activity that'll occur with each of your subjects. And the way we do it in our unit is that once we've got a calendar crafted, our research coordinators, our research nurses, will look at that and assign a time factor. And I'll give you an illustration of that. We usually try to estimate it with hours, do a consent, maybe take 30 minutes and so on and so forth. And then from that time, you calculate a labor cost factor. That's one of our biggest cost factors. So of course, there's going to be things like, CBCs, chemistries, and so forth, which you'd get from the clinical laboratory. Those costs that have to be added in as well. Determining standard of care versus study-related tests, extremely important. So once you've got your calendar developed, you have to determine what standard of care and what may be just strictly study-related, because those things cannot be billed to third-party payers. And of course, at the end here, I've got startup costs, which I'll give an illustration of. So here I just took an example. What I wanted to illustrate here was on the left side is the procedures. So that would be, what the subject will be moving towards in terms of evaluation. So here we've got listed here informed consent, physical exam, vital signs, and such. And then on the right side is the calendar where all these events are occurring. So that's where you would be checking off, okay, it's occurring here, here, and here. Now from that, we can develop a spreadsheet with the cost factors in here. So on this one here, it doesn't match up. I'm sorry about that. But if you look at, let's see, pharmacy dose preparation, $75, physical exam, $250, and you can see vital signs, it says standard of care. So there you would not charge, because that's be part of the care of that subject would get anyway, regardless if the patient was on the trial or not. And so forth. So it's pretty straightforward. You start with your calendar events, and then you can add in your cost factors, okay, which every department will be slightly different, okay. We in the CTRU, we have a labor factor that we use for all our labor costs. In another department, you may have another factor that you may want to use. And of course, when you get down here, we never want to forget our indirect costs at the bottom. I don't have a pointer. Do I have a pointer here? Yeah. Right there. So can't forget our friends in OSP and the institution, 26% for when you're getting extramural funding. That's for a trial that's, let's say, a pharma trial. This is the startup cost that we usually charge pharma right here. Things like IRB application preparation, regulatory document preparation. These items are a one-time cost factor that you should always ask for some dollars up front, okay? So this whole discussion was talking about investigator-initiated trials. We've even added, when we're proposing budgets to, let's say, pharma, we'll even add the time that the PI is spent on developing the protocol. And we would have, sometimes, I think we've gotten one funded for up to $10,000. Yeah, I believe. So you can ask for that kind of dollars if it's something going to be interesting to pharma. They're willing to pay that one-time upfront fee. All the time that's spent in putting the protocol together. And let's not forget our IRB down here. Okay, these are off. I think the IRB has increased their fees, so that's old. Okay. This is a worksheet that we use for our billing group here at the hospital. This would be filled out for when you're registering the protocol with the hospital billing. I don't know if that's relevant to, I think, for some of the folks in this audience, but basically when you're setting up in our electronic medical record system, there is a mechanism by which you can identify a protocol, the billing people, this is for billing, and then identify the tests that would be study related, so that the billing routing for that subject will go to the proper billing. In our unit, it would be for the CTRU, we would get, it would be designated for research billing, and it would be automatically routed when it's ordered. Okay, so this is a billing grid, and to be honest, I'm looking back at my staff. Are we doing this at all anymore?
Every study.
Every study. Thank you. And again, general rules for a third-party payer. The sponsor specifies paying for an item, it's not billable. If the ICF says the service will be for free of charge, don't bill it to the patient. That's not a good idea. If the item service is not medically necessary and is being for research purposes, this goes outside of standard of care, it is not billable. Just as an aside, we've been talking about investigator-initiated, but on some of our pharma trials, I've had to negotiate with pharmaceutical companies where they've asked, well, we need this particular imaging for the patient, but have the physician bill it to the insurance, and if they don't pay, we'll pay it. And I've argued that is not appropriate. It's either, if it's not standard of care, and it's deemed by the physician not standard of care, then the study has to pay for it. And I went around with the pharmaceutical company very recently on that fact, and we finally got it resolved, and that's not going to occur. I think here's our resources. Remick, did you want to say anything about it? Here's our blue book. Here it is. It's the internet.
So I hope that's helpful. I don't know if we have might be one other slide.
Is there anything else here? One more slide here. Oh, all the support services.
Things for the CTSI. So there you have it. I hope this is helpful. Maybe a lot of it's pretty basic, but maybe we've given you some thought, food for thought on how to go about things. I'd be happy to answer any questions, comments, thoughts, whatever.
Experiences. No. How many of you have written protocols? Okay.
Well, I cannot emphasize enough. This enterprise is growing here on campus, which is just really wonderful. Don't get stuck. Ask for help. And CTR is growing, and we have resources in the Cancer Center. John is kind of overseeing all of these operations. And there are many elements in the Blue Book that really are germane to not just cancer investigation, but any type of clinical investigation. And the biggest thing is don't be bashful. I remember my first program writing. If you don't write it, you're not going to get funded. So you gotta get pen to paper, good an idea, and go with it. And find the resources.
Do we have a question for Charleston?
Yes.
Yeah. What do I have to do?
Dan Lucas, how are you?
Hey, Dan.
Nice presentation. I appreciate you and John, and it's an excellent wide berth of information you share with us. I was curious about the WVU Charleston faculty, those hired by the university. Are they eligible for some of the things that you mentioned earlier in terms of both donation and the chancellor dollars associated with some of the pilot monies? Is that something that they would be eligible for? And if so, where would we get information to share with our local faculty?
So Dan, that's a great question. All your faculty members there should be eligible and can avail themselves of resources of the CTR. In the Cancer Center, if it's cancer focused, the one thing we do, particularly if it's like a pilot grant, we open it up to the university community, and they have to be part of the university to apply. And if they apply and an award should come to fruition, then the Cancer Center, as part of transferring the funds, asks that applicant to then apply for membership in the Cancer Center. So if an award is made, then that person, at least in the Cancer Center pilot projects, has to become a member, probably a clinical or an associate member if it's a young investigator. I think by virtue of anybody that's part of the Charleston Division, the School of Medicine, we're all considered members of the CTR, but there is a mechanism to register officially, so you get on the listserv, and you have all these announcements, get the benefit of all these announcements. But the answer is yes. Okay, terrific. Good luck to everybody.